They always warned him to stay away from the cliffs after rain. Stones shifted, old scars in the mountain loosened, and sometimes the earth decided it had held on long enough. But the sound Ethan Hale heard that afternoon wasn't just a rock slide. It was a roar buried inside a landslide's thunder, a sound too full of pain and fear to belong to anything he'd ever known. By the time it faded, he already knew one thing. If he pretended he hadn't heard it, he'd never sleep again. Ethan had grown up with the valley at his back and the mountain in his blood. His father used to joke that he'd learned to walk on a slope before he ever set foot on flat ground. Their cabin sat high above the clustered roofs of town, near the place where the pines thinned into broken stone and scrub. When his parents were alive, that height had felt like freedom. After the fever took them both in one bleak winter, the same distance felt like exile. Folks still saw him as that mountain boy, quiet, useful when you needed something carried, and easy to ignore once the chore was done. The mountain didn't ignore him, though. It kept him busy. That morning he'd gone out with his rope and axe to clear deadfall from the narrow trail above his cabin, the one that hugged the cliff face like a scar. The rain from 2 nights before had loosened everything: roots, stones, entire sheets of soil. He was working a stump out of the path when the ground under his boots shivered. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, a low, distant rumble like an old man clearing his throat. Then the sound deepened, rolling through the rock in long, heavy pulses. A few pebbles skittered down from the crags above, ticking against the larger stones near his feet. Ethan dropped the stump and stepped back, scanning the ridge. The mountain answered him with a roar. Dust and rock exploded from a narrow cleft farther along the cliff, turning the air white. The prolonged, grinding crash of stone on stone flooded his ears, swallowing everything else. He covered his head out of instinct, heart hammering. Rockfalls were part of life up here. You listened, you waited, you figured out if the mountain had taken something you needed. Only when the echoes started to fade did he hear it, the other sound hiding inside the chaos. It wasn't loud, not compared to falling rock, but it burrowed under his skin in a way the crash had not. A raw, ragged cry, almost like a human shout, if a human voice could carry that much depth. It rose once, cut off abruptly, then dissolved into a guttural moan that seemed to get stuck in the air. Ethan's stomach twisted. He'd heard elk scream when they broke a leg, heard wolves cry for a lost packmate, heard men curse when a tree fell the wrong way. This wasn't any of those. It was bigger, older, layered with something that made his scalp prickle. Fear. No, he breathed, as if arguing with the mountain itself. Not today. He should have gone back to the cabin, waited for dust to settle, walked down to the valley and told somebody what he'd heard. Let the rangers or the hunters, or anyone with more authority and less sense, handle it. But as he stood on that narrow trail, the wind shifted. It brought with it the smell of fresh broken stone, and under that, faint but unmistakable, the copper tang of blood. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening. His father's voice rose from memory, quiet and steady. You don't walk away from hurt if you can help it, son. Not animal hurt, not people hurt. The mountain's cruel enough without our help. That voice had carried him through more winters than he could count. It carried him now as he shouldered his rope, tightened his grip on the axe, and headed toward the dust. The closer he got, the thicker the haze became, hanging in the still air between cliff and trees like smoke. His boots slipped on fresh scree, small stones rolling underfoot, making each step a test of balance. He moved carefully, one hand skimming the rough wall, the other shielding his mouth and nose. The air tasted dry, gritty, every breath scratched. The world narrowed to gray and grit and that fading, shuddering moan. It took him longer than he expected to reach the fallen section. When he did, he stopped dead. A slab of rock the size of a wagon had sheared off from the cliff and dropped onto the narrow ledge below, splintering smaller boulders into chunks. Branches lay snapped like bones. The ground around the slide glistened with powdered stone. At first, all he saw was chaos. Then, in the broken shapes, something moved. A massive leg, fur matted with dust, twitched weakly from beneath the edge of the largest boulder. The foot at the end of it was too broad to belong to a deer, too long to belong to a bear. Dark, thick hair covered it, tangled with dirt and flecks of rock. His gaze traveled upward to the body pinned beneath. For a second, his mind refused to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. The creature lay half on its side, one shoulder and part of its chest crushed under the slant of the stone. The exposed half of its torso rose and fell in sharp, pained jerks. Its arms, thick as small trees, scrabbled weakly at the ground, claws digging furrows in the dust, and its head, turned slightly toward him, was unmistakable. The heavy brow ridge, the deep-set eyes, the broad muzzle framed in tangled hair. Ethan had heard the stories all his life, whispered at harvest fires, muttered over mugs in the Valley Tavern carved into warning signs at the ranger station. Don't go too high. Don't wander alone. Don't chase lights above the tree line. There's things up there, old men would say, eyes sliding toward the peaks. Things that watch from the dark. Bigfoot, sentinel, forest man. Names had changed with generations, but the idea stayed the same. A shadow on two legs, bigger than any man, smarter than any animal. Dangerous enough that the unwritten law of the valley was simple. If you saw one, you stayed quiet and walked away. Ethan had never expected to actually lay eyes on it. He certainly hadn't expected to see it like this. The Bigfoot's eyes found him almost immediately. They were not the glowing, bestial orbs of tavern tales. They were dark, ringed with red from dust and pain, and full of wary confusion. For a second, neither of them moved. The mountain, incredibly, fell silent around them. Ethan's heartbeat sounded too loud in his own ears. He swallowed, mouth dry. "You're real," he whispered, as if that were the thing that needed saying. The creature's lips pulled back slightly, not in a snarl, more a grimace. Pain shuddered through the visible part of its chest. Its right arm shifted, muscles bunching under fur. It tried to push against the rock. The boulder didn't notice. The effort tore a strangled sound from its throat, half roar, half plea. Ethan flinched as if struck. It should have been easy to turn away. Every story, every warning, every sign hammered into tree trunks up and down the valley screamed in his head, "Don't interfere. Don't get involved." If the mountain wanted a thing gone, who was he to argue? And yet, the way those eyes clung to his, the way the fingers of its free hand curled toward him, not reaching to grab, but reaching in the same instinctive way any hurt thing might reach for the nearest presence. The mountain's cruel enough without our help. His father's words again, as stubborn and immovable as the stone itself. "All right," Ethan said, voice shaking. "All right." He slid down the loose slope carefully, boots skidding. Up close, the Bigfoot was even more massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, though it was hard to tell exactly while it lay half-crushed. The smell of it hit him. Sweat, crushed grass, a coppery undercurrent of blood that cut through the dust. He forced himself not to gag. "Easy," he murmured, though he doubted the creature understood his words. Tone mattered more than language. Animals knew the difference between threat and, if not safety, at least not threat. The Bigfoot's eyes tracked his movements. When Ethan circled toward the boulder, it let out a low sound, almost like a warning. He stopped, hands spread. "I'm trying to help," he said. "This thing," he thumped the rock lightly with his fist, "is going to finish what it started if we don't move." He wasn't sure why he said "we." No version of this ended with the creature lifting its own prison. He studied the stone. It had wedged against a natural lip in the cliff, angling down over the ledge. Most of its weight pushed into the rock wall behind, but enough rested on the Bigfoot's chest and thigh to keep it pinned. If he tried to roll it the wrong way, he'd crush the creature completely, or send the whole slab tumbling downslope, taking himself with it. He chewed the inside of his cheek, mind racing. Rope, leverage. His father had taught him early. If you can't make yourself stronger, make the world help. He glanced around. A fallen tree lay not far from the slide, its trunk long and straight enough to serve as a lever if he could drag it into place. Another rock jutted from the slope beside the Bigfoot, solid enough to act as a pivot point. He turned back to the creature, heart pounding. "I have to step away," he said, gesturing with his hands. "I'll come back." The Bigfoot's breath rasped, harsh and shallow. Its fingers flexed, then stilled. It closed its eyes briefly, whether in pain or understanding he couldn't tell. Ethan climbed back up, lungs burning, and half slid, half ran to the fallen tree. It took everything he had to get the trunk moving. He dug his boots into the earth, braced his shoulder against the bark, and shoved. The log grudgingly surrendered an inch. Another. Sweat ran down his back despite the chill in the air. "Move," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Come on. Just move." Inch by stubborn inch, he rolled and dragged the log closer to the slide. Each time it caught on a rock, he adjusted, swore under his breath, and pushed again. He lost track of time. The sun crawled a little farther across the sky. His arms shook, his legs trembled, but he got it there. He wedged one end under the edge of the boulder, leveraging it against the outcropping beside the Bigfoot's pinned side. The boulder's full weight pressed down onto the makeshift lever, making it feel impossible before he even tried. He wiped dust from his mouth with the back of his hand and glanced at the creature. Its eyes were half closed now, breaths coming in shallow sips. Fear jolted through him. "Hey," he called softly. The eyes opened. "Don't quit on me yet." It made a low sound, something between a huff and a broken chuckle. The absurdity of that interpretation almost made him laugh. Instead, he took his position at the free end of the log, planted his feet, and heaved. At first, nothing happened. The log flexed beneath his hands, bark biting into his palms. The boulder might as well have been part of the mountain. Ethan grunted, shifted his stance, and threw the full weight of his body into the lever. The rock gave a fraction, no more than the width of his thumbnail, but the Bigfoot's body eased a hair beneath it. The creature gasped, air wheezing back into compressed lungs, and the sound poured strength into Ethan's tired muscles. He pushed harder. Pain shot up his shoulders, through his spine. His vision blurred at the edges. Slowly, agonizingly, the boulder lifted another inch. The mountain groaned in protest, small stones skittering down around them. "Move," he rasped to the rock, to his muscles, to the entire twisting situation. Just a little more. Another inch. The gap between stone and fur grew wide enough for one thick hand to slide free. The Bigfoot seized the chance, bracing its freed arm against the ground and pushing upward with a strength that made the log creak in Ethan's grip. Together, they shifted the weight just enough that the pressure on the creature's chest lessened. It dragged in a shuddering breath that sounded like air rushing into a bellows for the first time in years. The rock settled a moment later, dropping back onto the lever with a thud that rattled Ethan's teeth. He fell to his knees, chest heaving, arms useless lumps hanging from his shoulders. For a few seconds, all he could hear was his own pulse and the Bigfoot's ragged panting. The slab still pinned its thigh and part of its lower body. They hadn't finished the job, but the look in the creature's eyes had changed. Pain still haunted them, but something else flickered there too. Sharp, assessing, almost grateful. Ethan let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it weren't so frayed. "We're not done," he croaked. "But you're breathing. That's something." The Bigfoot blinked slowly. Its free hand flexed, then reached, not toward his throat, not toward his rope or his axe, but toward his shoulder. The pads of its fingers brushed his jacket with surprising gentleness, as if confirming he was solid, real, not some strange hallucination brought on by pain. The touch lasted only a second. When it withdrew, something heavy but steady settled in Ethan's chest. A shared understanding. A struck bargain he hadn't realized he'd agreed to until that moment. He didn't know it yet, and neither did the valley below. But from that touch on, whatever happened to one of them would no longer belong only to him. Ethan knelt beside the freed giant until the tremor in his arms turned into a deep, hollow shaking somewhere behind his ribs. The boulder was gone, but the damage it left wasn't. The Bigfoot's chest rose in rough, uneven pulls, and its leg lay at an angle that made Ethan feel queasy just looking at it. Down in the valley, bells began to ring, thin but urgent, blown uphill by the wind. People had heard the rock slide. They'd come looking. Ethan stared at the creature, then at the torn slope, and knew this wasn't where their story could end. Leaving it here meant wolves, scavengers, or men would finish the job the mountain started. Moving it meant risking his own neck, his own quiet life, in a way that couldn't be undone. His father's voice wouldn't stop repeating itself. "You don't walk away from hurt if you can help it, son." Ethan swallowed hard, tasting dust and blood. "Can you stand?" he asked, already bracing for the answer. The Bigfoot grunted, low and rough, and tried to shift. Pain shot through its face like lightning, but it pushed anyway. That stubbornness made his decision easier. He looped his rope around the creature's massive chest, above the worst bruising, tying the same hauling knots he'd used on fallen logs. When he slid under its arm, the weight of it nearly drove him to his knees. Heat poured off the Bigfoot's body, hot as a banked fire. "Lean on me," Ethan muttered, jaw clenched. They rose together, inch by inch, until the giant stood hunched against the cliff, one huge hand pressed to the rock, the other resting lightly on his shoulder, as if afraid to crush him accidentally. The first step nearly took them both down. The broken leg buckled, the Bigfoot's full weight sagging through Ethan's ribs. He dug his boots into the stone, teeth bared, and held. "No," he growled. "Not after all that." Somehow the creature caught itself, shifting more weight to its good leg. They tried again. Step, drag, breathe. The path back toward Ethan's cabin slanted along the slope, narrow and treacherous. familiar to him in a way no valley man would ever understand. Today it felt like a test the mountain had written just for him. They moved in ragged rhythm, pausing often so the Bigfoot could gasp shallow breaths and Ethan could steady the shaking in his thighs. Each pause was a risk. Every moment spent on open rock gave the searchers below more time to climb. Once, Ethan thought he heard voices carried on the wind, fragments of shouted orders. He didn't look back. The only direction that mattered was upslope, toward the small patch of trees and smoke-stained roof that had always meant home, and now meant hideout, shelter, and secret all at once. When the cabin finally came into view, half hidden between two pines, Ethan almost laughed from sheer relief. His legs felt like water, his shoulders like they'd been hammered. "Almost there," he muttered, though his voice came out as a rasp. The Bigfoot made a sound that could have been agreement or simple breath. At the door, they had to hunch and twist. The frame wasn't built for something this big. Wood scraped fur. The cabin, which had always felt too empty, shrank around them the second the creature ducked inside. Ethan guided it to the bed, his father's old one, the only surface wide enough, and the frame groaned under the new weight. For a second, he imagined the entire thing collapsing in a storm of splinters. It held. He staggered back, bracing his hands on the table to keep from tipping over. The Bigfoot lay half-curled, chest pumping, eyes flickering over the low ceiling, the stove, the single window. This close, it looked less like a monster from Valley Warnings and more like a battered, cornered animal, trying to decide if it could trust the box it was in. Instinct took over. Ethan warmed water, gathered rags, crushed what dried herbs he had left, and went to work on the worst of the wounds. He'd done this for goats and strays. He did it now for something that could close a hand around his skull. When he cleaned the bruised chest, the Bigfoot flinched, a deep rumble escaping its throat. Ethan murmured, "I know. Hurts now, helps later," and kept going. The leg made him wince. The break was ugly, swollen under the fur. He splinted it as best he could with chair slats and strips of cloth. Outside, bells and calls rose and fell throughout the day. Once, boots crunched on the lower trail. Ethan froze, breath held, every sense narrowed on the door. A ranger's voice drifted up, laughing lightly about rock falls and old wives' tales, before the group moved on. No one thought to look higher, at a leaning cabin tucked into a fold of stone, where their legends were bleeding on a borrowed bed. When the footsteps faded, Ethan let himself collapse onto the floor by the stove, every muscle singing with exhaustion. The days that followed settled into a strange, tense rhythm. By morning, he checked the Bigfoot's leg, changed bandages, coaxed water between its teeth. By afternoon, he hunted fast and low, staying off main trails, bringing back enough food for 2 ravenous bodies. By evening, he sat by the bed, listening to the storm of rumor echoing faintly from the valley below. Men swearing they'd seen huge tracks, women insisting the mountain was restless again, children daring each other to climb higher come summer. Inside the cabin, the subject of those stories learned how to breathe easier. Trust grew in tiny, fragile steps. At first, the Bigfoot tensed whenever Ethan approached its injured leg, eyes going hard and distant. When Ethan spoke, its ears flicked, but its gaze stayed fixed on the ceiling as if waiting for a blow. Slowly, as the worst pain ebbed, that changed. The creature began to watch his hands instead, tracking every motion. It reached for the cup when he lifted it. Once, when he nearly dropped a bowl, a huge hand shot out to catch it before it hit the floor, then set it gently back on the table. Names came next, or something close. One evening, while the rain whispered on the roof, Ethan tapped his chest. "Ethan," he said, slow and clear. He repeated it twice more. The third time, the Bigfoot huffed softly and tapped its own chest with thick fingers, letting out a low, distinct sound that sat somewhere between a grunt and a breath. Ethan couldn't copy it properly, but he tried anyway. The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been the first shadow of a smile. Whatever it was, the cabin felt different after that. Less like a hiding place, more like shared ground. The valley's search flared and dimmed. One day, distant rifle shots cracked the air, sharp against the cliffs. Another, he heard voices closer than before, arguing about strange fur caught on broken branches near the slide. "Could be a bear," someone said. "Could be something else," another replied quietly. Ethan stiffened when they spoke about checking Hale's boy's place, but they never came. Maybe it was distance, or weather, or simple habit. People were used to leaving him alone up here. The same neglect that had once stung now wrapped him and his secret like a shield. The moment everything truly shifted came not from hunters or horns, but from the sky. A week after the rockfall, dark clouds rolled in fast, piling against the ridges like bruises. The air turned sharp, metal tasting. Ethan stepped outside to latch the shutter and saw them, a knot of 3 children picking their way along the lower trail below his cabin, too high and too late with a storm coming. One slipped. He watched, helpless for a breath, as the tallest lost his footing and vanished over the edge, the other 2 screaming his name. Ethan grabbed his rope on instinct and ran, the slope blurred under his boots. Rain began in earnest, slicking stone, filling the air with noise. At the drop, he found the boy clinging to a narrow ledge far below, boots dragging small slides of gravel toward a fall he wouldn't survive. The 2 younger children sobbed at the top, faces white. "Don't move," Ethan yelled down, tying off his line around a stout pine, hands moving with remembered certainty even as his heart raced. He wrapped the rope around his waist and went over the edge. The descent was clumsy, jarring. His boots scraped rock, slipped, found purchase again. The ledge rushed up too fast. He hit harder than planned, shoulder slamming into stone. The boy grabbed him in blind panic, nearly pulling them both off. "Easy," Ethan barked, pressing them back into the cliff, breath burning. Up close, the kid was just that, a scared valley child whose curiosity had outrun his sense. Ethan lashed a short length of rope around the boy's chest, tying him into his own line. "Feet on the rock," he said. "We go up together. Don't look down." Their climb was a brutal echo of his struggle on the ledge with the Bigfoot. Weight pulling down, stone crumbling, every upward step fought for. Twice the boy slipped, legs kicking at empty air. Twice the rope caught, biting into Ethan's ribs. At the top, small hands reached out, grabbing cloth and skin, dragging them over the lip in a tangle of limbs and gasps. Moments later, another section of the already weakened trail let go with a grinding roar, rocks and mud cascading over the spot where they'd just been clinging to life. When the search party arrived, their lanterns flickering in the storm gloom, rifles slung, faces tight, what they saw was simple. A mountain boy soaked to the bone, rope burned and shaking, with 3 valley children clinging to him like he was the strongest thing they knew. Gratitude poured out in shouts and rough pats on the shoulder. The kids, between sobs, kept repeating, "Ethan pulled me up. Ethan caught us," until his name felt like a stranger's. Someone muttered, half awed, "Guess the mountain's got its own guardian now." The words lodged somewhere deep inside him. Later, back in his cabin, the storm pounding on the roof, Ethan recounted the day in short, exhausted phrases. The Bigfoot listened, head tilted, eyes bright in the firelight. When he mimed the fall and the climb with his hands, the creature huffed a sound that was not quite laughter, not quite relief, and then copied the motion of pulling someone up. There was recognition in that gesture, of shared strain, shared choice. Ethan sank down by the bed, rope still hanging from his waist, and realized his life had split cleanly in two, before the rock slide and after. Down in the valley, stories spread about the landslide, about the kids, about Ethan Hale standing on a cliff in the rain with a rope and no sense of his own limits. People still talked about Bigfoot, of course. They argued over tracks, over shadows, over whether the mountain was hiding something. But whenever the cliffs were mentioned now, Ethan's name was there too, tangled up with the fear. In his cabin, with a healing giant watching him from his father's bed, Ethan understood what the mountain had done. It had tied their fates together. Whatever happened next would shake more than stone.